there are differences in politics that cannot be mediated by logic. And this is something that I think a lot of people have some trouble dealing with. There's a tendency nowadays, people talk about this thing that is called identity politics, right? So identity politics, whenever someone's talking about that, they're talking about it in a bad sense. Identity politics is bad. But there's some sense in which pretty much all politics in one way or another is a form of identity politics. And it might not be blatant, but there's a lot of sense in which the policies you take are often those that benefit you at a subtle level, or at least are not massively antagonistic to you. Now, one example I like to use is, I live in Georgia right now. I actually grew up in Georgia. I've been moving around, but I grew up in Georgia. And one political issue in Georgia is that we share borders with both Alabama and South Carolina. And those borders are partially mediated by rivers. Now, one political issue that has been important for all of these states is which states have the rights to manipulate the river. Where can you dump things? Where can you take water out? Whose right is it to use the river and stuff like this? Now, in the case of the factory worker who's going to be unemployed, you can take an economic bugman perspective of, well, there are two sides. There's the pro-mechanization and anti-mechanization side. But really, the pro-mechanization side, they are in the long term more efficient. But in a lot of political affairs, it is really just a zero-sum game. So if Georgia and Alabama have a dispute over how to use the river that partially separates the states, they will... There's not like a rational side and an irrational side. One party wants to be able to dump here. One party wants to be able to take water out lower on the river or something like this. This is something that happens all the time. So a lot of people have the idea when they're dealing with politics that there are rational people and there are irrational people. And the problem is we need to make people more rational and then we could all agree on the same things. But the reality is, in a lot of places, the problem is there's no concrete thing called public will. People have different opinions. Those people might belong to different social, political, racial, economic groups that have different interests, but it's not necessarily the case that all of society has those same interests. Now, Schumpeter puts it, this is on page 251, he says there is, first, no such thing as a uniquely determined common good that all people could agree on or be made to agree on by the force of rational argument. One of the things you need to get used to in politics is that what's good for one person might not be good for another, and it's not necessarily the case that there is some rational way, even if we could convince people, even if we could convince them or make them rationally rational or rationally knowledgeable instead of rationally ignorant, even if we could transcend those informational boundaries, there's still a sense in which sometimes what's good for you is just good for you, and what's good for someone else is just good for someone else. Schumpeter also says, this is a couple pages later, he says, though a common will or public opinion of some sort may still be said to emerge from the infinitely complex and individual group-wise situations, volitions, influences, actions, and reactions of the democratic process, the results lack not only rational unity, but also rational sanction. Now, his point here is that in democratic society, what often happens is the different interests in society, again, class interests, racial interests, other economic interests, things like this, or even geographic interests in the sense of one state wanting a river and another state wanting a river. They can compete in a lot of ways, and what policies they end up making together in the federal legislature or somewhere else aren't necessarily going to be something even either of them really want. I mean, we live in a society where often you'll have a political party which starts some kind of government program, and the other party doesn't want to support it or wants to undermine it or get rid of it. And so we end up in a position where it's sort of, a prisoner's dilemma, in the sense that we have a lot of things in political affairs that are flawed because there is a difference in opinion between or incentives or interests between the two different groups. Now, this is not so much, this is not something that's going to go away. There is just a sense in which no matter how you organize your society, there's no such thing as just everyone having the same interest, even if it's just you and another guy who make decisions, quote unquote, democratically. There's no way for you to perfectly have perfectly aligned interests. It's not just that we're a multi-ethnic society, so we have different racial interests. We also have different economic interests between different classes. We also have different geographic interests, etc., etc., etc. Now, this is often something that's not too difficult for people to understand, but it does take an extra level of introspection, I guess, to make the next leap. And the next leap is, while we can look at other people in politics, we can look at our political opponents, and we can see, they're being irrational. They're using logic, but they're using logic as just kind of formalware. They are really just doing what they already think is true at a pre-rational level, and we, as their political enemies, we can see through that. We can see every logical node in their decision-making might be flawed or based on bad assumptions or wishful thinking, and oftentimes it's coded in, cool, calm, allegedly dispassionate rhetoric. But when we see political enemies advocating for something that is in their interest, they might adopt some kind of ideology to propose it, but we can usually see through that, right? And in the same way, they can see through our pretenses. That is, you might take some kind of deep ideological stance that has all these principles and stuff like that, but at the core, you're just defending yourself from assault.